Hello, very beautiful community. Jon Stewart has eviscerated, depoliticized liberals over the issue of Joe Rogan. Now, is he right? We're going to watch and react. The point of this is not to give points to one side or another about how one should engage in public discourse. The point is to manipulate you in a benign way, to support you, to sit better with your own conflictive instincts about how to deal politically with speech you find offensive, basically, in a completely unregulated discourse environment, right? Because we're talking about public squares which are controlled by unaccountable companies that have no expertise or legitimacy to decide what happens and what doesn't happen in our public squares, but that is indeed what they're doing. Let's watch.
John, you've been on Rogan a couple of times?
Yes.
What did you think of that experience, being on Joe Rogan?
I enjoyed being on Rogan. I think he's an interesting interviewer. There are right-wing, weaponized commentators whose sole purpose is to manipulate things to the benefit of the Bannon Project or the Project 2025. Rogan's not that guy.
Okay, so here Jon Stewart's making a simple distinction between instrumentalized and less instrumentalized speech, weaponized and less weaponized speech. At one extreme, you have a sort of enterprise like Mr. Solovyov's work for Mr. Putin. You might not find equivalents of that quite as extreme in the United States, but you can get close. At the other end is responsible, grounded, mature discourse. And that distinction shouldn't necessarily decide for you who should and shouldn't be engaged with, because you could still engage with completely instrumentalized voices as long as you understand that that is how they operate. So it's a helpful distinction, but it's not a distinction that settles the question of who should talk to whom.
What is that guy? How would you
That
describe
guy
him?
is a curious comic who fell into this thing that got fucking enormous, maybe doesn't has opinions all over the political spectrum, but has tendencies that people on the left does not fit the aesthetic. He's a hunter.
Okay. So Jon Stewart's saying a little bit about Joe Rogan. There are about 77 things to say about Rogan, but let's say two. One is that he has a kind of healthy masculine groundedness that runs out of steam in certain domains, and then in those domains, Joe Rogan stops being a man and becomes a boy. Now, the fact that he has a positive masculine groundedness in any area is already impressive if you compare him to other figures who lost men look up to, like Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is lost existentially across the board. Joe Rogan isn't. But he doesn't just have blind spots, he has kind of comical, knuckle-dragging blindness about his blind spots. And that contributed to him getting lost politically, increasingly in recent years. Now, this wasn't helped by how mainstream media and in many ways the liberal journalistic elite handled him. But nevertheless, Rogan had this propensity to get lost and not notice that he was lost. An aside about how Rogan was handled. When somebody says that 2 + 2 = 5, it's a terrible idea to correct them by saying they're wrong and they've said that 2 + 2 is 500. No, they didn't say it's 500. They said it's 5 and they're wrong. But they didn't say it's 500, right? So if you're CNN, you don't say that Rogan wants people to use a horse tranquilizer. You say the exact way in which he's got certain issues of policy and certain issues of the latest available medical information wrong. So there was a lot of resistance liberal illusion in the way Rogan's political untethering and unraveling got mishandled. But broadly speaking, there's two things you've got to understand. He's got a solid masculine groundedness, which then rapidly runs out when it comes to certain things like politics, right? I mean, it's not complex politically to grasp the fact that Trump is spectacularly self-serving, irresponsible, buffoonish, post-truth authoritarian populist. Sound analysts are not surprised by what Trump is doing in office relative to their own expectations before. So it took a lot of naivety of Rogan to fall for that. But then there is a very big picture here, and that is in a completely unfiltered public square that is sort of vaguely owned by these potato chip companies who have certain rules about how you operate, but then also complete absence of rules too in certain respects. That information environment is simply going to get people lost unless they're freaks. If you comment on politics regularly in this environment, then you grow. You're going to lose your way eventually unless you are freakishly stable and perhaps have a lot of your intellectual life off the platform where you appear and discuss things. So Rogan couldn't handle being in the open ocean, right? He became a boy. It was all too much. It was too big for him. But we have to understand that the main story there isn't Rogan losing his way. It's the fact that we're not doing anything about people just unconstrained floating in the ocean. And this raises a very serious issue of what the philosopher Quentin Skinner would call silent power. Because the last thing you want to say if you want to be a serious person, if you want to be an effective citizen, efficacious citizen, is wouldn't it be good if Joe Rogan were responsible? Wouldn't it be good if he didn't lose his way during the public health crisis? Wouldn't it be good if he didn't have Musk on a couple of days ago and only watched about 4 minutes of it? And Musk was saying psychotically delusional things. And I didn't see Rogan's reaction, but presumably he was sitting there and nodding. So what you don't want to say is, if only Rogan behaved well, then it would be good. Because you're saying, therefore, that the stability of your democracy is predicated on a masculine, solid, MMA-loving, marijuana-smoking, hunting, somewhat knuckle-dragging boy, having sound political understanding and sound ethics around how you discuss politics, right? You don't want to say that. You don't want to say that your democracy is contingent on Joe Rogan not being a wally. Because if you're saying that, you're ignoring a very serious structural problem. Any democracy that depends on Joe Rogan not being a wally is a democracy in trouble, even if Joe Rogan weren't a wally, right? So it's this issue of silent power, right? That it's a problem, even if somebody is doing everything you'd like them to do, that they have the capacity to do things that you wouldn't like them to do. The fact that they're not doing these things you wouldn't like them to do doesn't mean there isn't a problem, right? So if Joe Rogan were behaving impeccably as you would like him to behave, there'd still be this huge structural problem, namely the fact that massive spaces in our culture could host the kind of things they're hosting now, if only the whims of the owners of the podcasts, the programs, the channels went differently. So understand that you don't want to be saying that. You want to focus on the structural issue. You don't want to focus primarily on how somebody gets something wrong. Okay, let's rock and roll.
Kind of Nazi curious. That's not good.
I've interviewed Kissinger. And he was carpet bomb curious.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say. It's very easy to castigate those where we're like, but he had an opinion a few years back that's, corrosive.
But the difference is when he was carpet bomb curious, you didn't say, oh, yeah, that's awesome. And what happens with Rogan sometimes is he'll hear somebody that's on the dangerous end of the spectrum, and he'll just kind of soak it in.
And I think this is a great point.
So this is quite important, right? We've got a lot of imitation of journalism. And again, the problem is primarily the structure. It's not Joe Rogan. But Rogan didn't have the skills to interview Trump in the run-up to the election. He didn't have the political knowledge. He didn't have the understanding of how politics works to challenge Trump, even if he wanted to. That's a problem. So we've got a lot of this sort of imitation of journalism going on, when in fact we're not getting journalism, we're getting something else. We're getting entertainment, or we're getting propaganda. But again, and I'm sure as Jon Stewart goes on, we'll have a chance to repeat ourselves here. Make a distinction between your account of the way Joe Rogan has personally lost his way and your account of what is a politically effective way to react to what he is doing. Don't confuse the two. I think we'll get a chance to say more about this in a second.
And it's whoever job who thinks that information is dangerous to fight to get their point of view out there to counter what they think is misinformation. You can't just deputize people to say he should have known better and he should have prosecuted that point.
Okay. So what Jon Stewart is saying here is that you can't say that decent people get to stay out of messy public spaces. You can't do moral superiority instead of civic participation. You can't think of politics as contamination. You have to think of it as persuasion. You can't focus on being right. You have to focus on being effective. And we have talked repeatedly about hyper-identity politics, by which I mean a tendency to take political disagreement and conceive of it as core moral disagreement, to then take this core moral disagreement and relate it to identity. It's what I am. The belief I have is not just a core moral belief, but it's definitionally what I am in this world, right? And then moreover, having dragged politics into morality and morality into identity, we demand of institutions that they inculcate this identity, or they take sides on issues of this identity and inculcate this identity in their members. And that encourages the thought that if you are right, the people you disagree with shouldn't be there. And Joe Rogan just shouldn't be there. But he is there. Where's your magic wand to turn Joe Rogan into somebody who engages in politics in a different way to the way he does? You don't have it. You can go like this, you can close your eyes, but that won't make your political opponents go away. It'll actually make them go on without you and probably defeat you. You don't get to choose who sits at the table of politics with you. The only way that you could conceivably get to choose if you secede or emigrate, right? Or if you have two ways of getting what you want. One is via tyrannical power. You can just take away all the voices that you don't like. Another is via bringing about that you have a healthy polity in which all the main voices are constructive actors. Well, how are you going to get that without a magic wand? So there's a very interesting challenge here, namely that hyper-identity politics leads you to conflate your opinions about somebody's personal responsibility in the way they're conducting themselves or the way they're conducting their platform with your views about what is the correct political response to this, right? From the fact that you think that Joe Rogan has partly lost his way on politics, it doesn't follow that responsible voices shouldn't go on his platform or shouldn't somehow engage with him or shouldn't be very compassionate and empathetic and open toward people who watch Joe Rogan so as to persuade them of things that they don't believe but could believe conceivably. And there is something else here, and that's that there is a connection between wokeism and technocracy, because technocracy says, forget the disagreement out there in society. We're going to decide what's right in virtue of some kind of application of expertise. And people might disagree with us, but we have the expertise, and so we'll handle it. Disputation out there in society shouldn't condition the conclusions that are derived from appropriate expertise. And so here we go. Well, the trouble with that is that it perpetuates the woke perspective that voices you find offensive shouldn't be heard, without any kind of political machinery to back that stance up. Because if you don't have the power to take away these voices you don't like, what are you going to do? You're going to be waving magical wands that don't exist. And then all you're left with is to engage constructively via tolerance. Right? Tolerance is the capacity to keep engaging with things that you don't like, with things that you find offensive, with things that go against your values, with things you find, damagingly untruthful and so on. So there is that kind of connection because both technocracy and wokeism try to eliminate the idea that you have to take political disagreement seriously, that you have to take what people in their millions in the country feel and think seriously. And that's a problem because the consequence of this kind of non-political politics is that you end up losing, right? And all the causes which you try to advance via this kind of pretense that you can choose who you share the table of politics with get retarded. They don't get progressed by this kind of approach. It's not effective.
But the reality is, John, is that it might be my job or the New York Times job or even your job, but I don't have the audience that Joe Rogan does.
Then get it.
Yeah,
then find
get
people
it.
who do. Then go on. Then go on that show. Then do those things. Like that is. It's not acceptable to just say, "Well, I don't like what he does." Then do it better. Beat them at their own game. It's not enough to just complain that that guy got a platform and don't platform that guy. There's no one in this world right now that isn't platformed.
And pointing out that something is untrue or that something is not responsible, it doesn't actually strengthen your political position. It doesn't gain you support. It doesn't gain you power. In fact, typically it ostracizes you from effective participation in politics. So you've got to be very, very careful to understand that truth or an constructive and ethical approach to engaging in politics don't have their own police. Just because you have a good relationship with the truth or because you proceed with integrity doesn't mean that these things have social force. They don't. Whether they have social force or not depends on the kind of engagement to back them up that people generate. In of themselves, these things don't have social force. Truth doesn't have social force in virtue of being truth rather than falsehood.
My biggest frustration, honestly, with a lot of scientists is they all go, RFK, oh, he's so fucked up. That's terrible information. Oh, okay. What's the information? Nothing. Where are they? Get out there. Fight.
Yeah. I think it's complex with scientists. I would accept both perspectives from scientists. So I'd accept the perspective that says, I'm not going to go and debate RFK on Joe Rogan's podcast because RFK is not a legitimate expert, and therefore my perspective will be equalized with his. At the same time, you do need to participate in our information environment as it is and not in it as it should be. And you need to go where there are a lot of ears and a lot of eyeballs. Now, one of the things that Ezra Klein rightly mentions when we talk about these sorts of issues is that there has been a kind of politicization of self-help, that you have got certain kinds of self-help that might trend more female. You can think of folks like Brene Brown or Esther Perel. Esther Perel is absolutely wonderful, by the way. I highly recommend her. She rarely says anything extraordinary. In fact, almost all she says is quite prosaic and banal. But others in her sphere are so short of being able to say all the simple and basic things that in saying simple and basic things, Esther Perel looks extraordinary. Now, the problem is that self-help has become politicized, and a lot of male self-help has become fused with what I call the X-right, populist X-conservative way of going on politically, has got fused with men taking responsibility personally, men taking responsibility professionally, men taking responsibility entrepreneurially, men taking responsibility for their bodies, and so on. Now, a lot of this self-help culture is superficial. It leaves men still sheep, but sheep in wolves' clothes. It doesn't make them wolves. Wolves taken constructively here, not destructively. But this kind of politicization is really bad, and so we need to rescue male self-help from the ex-conservative bucket into which it has overwhelmingly fallen. So, final remark here: the cost of moralizing your response about how to engage with somebody like Joe Rogan in the culture, instead of politicizing this, is that you're going to lose, and that you're going to let politics bypass you, giving your political opponents the initiative. What you should instead engage in is persuasion, accurate representation of the flaws of your political opponents, and a cause and effect way of thinking about who should do what and how and when politically, right? You're thinking, should my politician go on the Joe Rogan podcast? It's got nothing to do with how irresponsible Joe Rogan's interview of Trump was, or how much psychotic post-truth you voluminously hear on the Rogan podcast every damn week. It should be about sending my politician that I happen to like on Joe Rogan, bring it about that they get sort of infinitesimally closer to power, right? So it's constructive cause and effect thinking. And you can still go on and psychoanalyze what's gone wrong for Joe Rogan, why he's got so lost politically. But don't conflate that with what should be a constructive political response around what sort of conduct you would recommend to your political representatives, for instance, or just people in the culture you follow who are engaging in discourse constructively. The idea that you should isolate constructive discourse from unconstructive discourse is a recipe for political defeat. Lots of love, Toxin.